let me get my pages up before we start my time. My last speech of the evening. I appreciate your attendance. I appreciate your attention. Been a nice audience, well behaved, and I hope you've profited from the discussion between Mr. Hatcher and myself. Now, Mr. Hatcher keeps mentioning this statement up here. I believe I'm going to have to rewrite this for people that are a little bit dense and foggy like Mr. Hatcher, because even after I explained to him that I was simply taking an assumption that somebody makes that there is an absence of commands. I didn't say there were absence of commands. I'm simply taking what others have said. Men like Mr. Hatcher say that there's no commands, and I'm going to put you some up here on the board. Like N.B. Hardman said, there's not even a shadow of a mention in the New Testament. And Mr. Hatcher would tell you that they're not commanded in the New Testament. Well, now, I'm taking their statement. Friends, I'm not saying their absence of commands. I'm telling you Ephesians 5:19 commands instrumental music. Colossians 3:16 commands instrumental music. The New Testament commands instrumental music. I'm telling you this because it commands you to use psalms. And that's part of the Word of Christ, according to Colossians 3:16. He put up a chart up here. It was OTL 8, and he quoted Matthew 17:5. It says, "Hear ye him." Now, Mr. Hatcher, if you'll read Colossians 3:16, the Word of Christ in Colossians 3:16 says to use psalms. And according to your own brethren, psalms command instrumental music. Now, you want to expel them and say they've been done away with because you quote and say the law's been done away with, but you don't show us anything where that the psalms have not been reaffirmed, even if they were done away with, as you say. And I'm not saying that like he was going to maybe accuse me of saying that. Even if he were right that the Psalms have been done away with, Paul raised them from the dead in Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16. So we're commanded to use Psalms, and they're a part of the Word of Christ, Colossians 3:16. Hear ye him, Mr. Hatcher. Now don't come up here again and tell people, as you did over and over again in that speech, that Bob Ross ever said there was an absence of commands. I was simply taking what men like you have said. And I have said that even if that were the case, this would not be evidence within itself that they were not used in the New Testament. Now get it straight. Now I'm going to rewrite that and send him another copy to take the place of this one so he can understand what Ross means. Because it's either dullness on his part, dimwittiness on his part, or unethical behavior, because I'm telling him up here, I did not say this. I'm taking the assumption, like Paul did in some of his writings, and people said, oh, well, he says don't keep the law. He said, I never did say that. Come on, Mr. Hatcher, get with it. Straighten this thing out. Quit falsely representing what I have to say here on the subject. Now, he says, I'll agree with what the New Testament says, but Hatcher won't tell us what it says, will he? He doesn't want to take sides with either one of these men that I put up here. He said, all these men agree on this subject. Well, I didn't read them like you did then, brother. I got one of them saying that Amos condemned David, and the other one saying that he didn't condemn David. That's agreement? He said, oh, these disagreements among men are on the Old Testament. Well, he's not going to take sides with either one of them, regardless of which testament it's on, is he? Where's the passage, he says, that tells us to do it today? I've been giving it to you over and over again. Ephesians 5:19 and Colossians 3:16. Now, he says, I want to notice his admission that there is an absence of command. Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, I've admitted nothing about there being an absence of command. I simply took the statement of men like Hatcher who say that there are no commands in the New Testament. And I said, even if there were absence of commands, this would not prove anything for their case. That's what I was arguing. Now, he says that Colossians 2:14 will do away with the Psalms. Well, Paul didn't know it because he told us to use them in Colossians 3:16. And why is he using them in his songbook? Didn't he say he had so many songbook, and yet they've been done away with? And what about that, Brother Schweitzer? He does away with the Psalms, and now he's raised them up and put them in his songbook, and he's going to use them. What about that? Can you believe it? Now he says on his charts, OTL 6, 2, 1, and 8, he has those up here, and I agree with every passage on there, but Hatcher doesn't. Look what he said about Romans 15:4. He says, we learn from the Old Testament. Well, let's read Romans 15:4, ladies and gentlemen, and see just what it actually says. Hatcher gets up here and tries to tell us, well, the law is fulfilled, it's done away with. In one place, he even said in the newspaper, it's vanished away. But listen to this, Romans 15:4. Whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning. Now, Mr. Hatcher, he doesn't want any part of that learning, does he? He doesn't want to learn from what was written aforetime. He wants to do away with it. All right, now he said, Paul and Silas in prison, Acts 16. How are they going to use a musical instrument? Well, Mr. Hatcher, that wasn't the church, was it? You know, there's a lot of things going down there in prison that weren't in the church. That's the way you answer arguments like that, isn't it? That wasn't in the church. Now he says, Ross admits there's an absence of command. Said it again. No, Ross hasn't. He said Ross referred to the New Testament as modified law. That's a distortion. I said the New Testament modifies Old Testament ordinances and sacrifices that were for the time. You read the book of Hebrews and you'll see what Ross had to say. All right, now let's get back to my charts, brother, and pick up where we left off on those if we can. Let's see. I believe we're down. Put the next one up that you have in line there. I believe it's on the nature of law. The nature of law. Once a law has been enacted, it remains in force until repealed or otherwise modified. Now that is standard doctrine. That is standard fact. If you don't believe it, just go out here and try to violate some law just because you haven't heard it repeated in the last 5 or 10 years, and you'll find out about it. The law on music has never been repealed or modified. Not only has music not been repealed or modified, its use has been reaffirmed in Ephesians 5:19 and Colossians 3:16. All that he can quote you about the law, fulfill, vanish away, or whatever, he's going to still have to face the reaffirmation of Psalms in Ephesians 5:19 and 3:16. If my opponent knows a verse wherein music has been repealed or modified, let him give it. Give me New Testament number 1. New Testament does not exclude instruments. Hear me now. Did he say anything about Jesus and the apostles fulfilling the law by keeping the law and using musical instruments? He dodged that. He didn't even mention it, did he? You know why? He can't find a verse that said Jesus and the apostles used musical instruments. And that would condemn Jesus and the apostles to hell if we took his law of silence, wouldn't it? Because silence would prove that Jesus and the apostles never obeyed the law. Now, wouldn't it? If he can't find a verse that says that Jesus and the apostles used musical instruments, how is he going to prove they kept the law that commanded them to use musical instruments? His law of silence is going to send Jesus and the apostles to hell. That's what it's going to do. Now look here, N.B. Hardeman, their great champion. He said the New Testament says not a word about instrumental music. There is not a shadow of a shade of an intimation of a mention of the mechanical music throughout all of the New Testament. That's from the Hardeman debate with Boswell, page 187. What right does my opponent have to modify the lawfulness of music if Hardeman's statement is accepted as truth? That should be 1M up there. 1M on Hardeman. Now what right does he have to say that music is unlawful in the light of Hardeman's statement? Hardeman says that the New Testament has not a word to say about instrumental music. Well then, it hasn't been modified. It hasn't been repealed. It hasn't been annulled. It hasn't been done away. It hasn't vanished away because the New Testament says not a word about it. So it's still in effect. Jesus and the apostles kept the law, and it didn't say they did by way of using musical instruments, did it? Does it say Jesus took an organ or a harp or a psaltery and played on it to fulfill the law? Well now, look at Hardeman's statement now, not a word about it. What right then does he have to question the use of instrumental music if it says nothing about it in the New Testament? If this be the case, Old Testament musical instruments are not affected by New Testament teaching. Consequently, the lawfulness of instruments remains in force, the same as other moral and spiritual laws and principles which span the whole of time, past and present. The reaffirmation of the use of psalms without any modification on musical instruments clearly establishes New Testament support for the use of instruments. By the so-called law of exclusion, only those things specifically named are included in the category of having been fulfilled. And instrumental music is not mentioned, says Mr. Hardeman, the champion of this anti-instrumental music cause. Now, New Testament 2, NT2, the New Testament is supposedly silent on instrumental music, according to those who oppose it. Batsell Barrett Baxter, he says, the Scriptures do not mention instrumental music. N.B. Hardeman says the New Testament says not a word about instrumental music. Therefore, since the New Testament is silent, it makes no modification of the Old Testament principle on the use of instruments of music. Let us respect the silence. Be silent where the Bible is silent. The New Testament is silent on the modification of the use of psalms with instruments in worship. We may not add to or take from the established lawful use of psalms with instruments of worship. We must not violate the laws which God has made. We must not make laws which God has not made, says Roy Deaver in his book, Ascertaining Bible Authority. So do you people respect Bible authority and silence, or you just rattle off, we speak where the Bible speaks and keep silence where the Bible is silent, and it means absolutely nothing? You going to keep silent on this instrumental music thing since the New Testament is silent on it, and quit harping away and hacking away and beating down instrumental music? You say the New Testament is silent, and yet you go around here harping against it and fighting against it, and you say the New Testament is silent, and you keep harping against it and harping against it? Why don't you keep silent where the Bible is silent on this instrumental music question? Now let's look at DC 1. Direct command for instrumental music. Colossians 3, 16, 17. Let the word of Christ, dwell in you richly, in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another, in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. All psalms have been done away. They vanished away. Paul didn't know anything about it. Whatsoever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord, giving thanks to God and to the Father by Him. This direct command to use psalms authorizes instrumental music because the psalms authorize the use of instruments according to spiritual sword. 790, page 20. No New Testament passage can be quoted which annuls, modifies, or abrogates the use of psalms, instruments with psalms. If this is not so, give the verse, Mr. Hatcher. Then let's look at approved example. There's a approved example for instrumental music. Jesus and the apostles used instrumental music. Jesus taught us to do all things He commanded, follow after the righteousness that He established. All instances in the Bible where instrumental music is used in the praise and worship of God were lawful, and we learn, Romans 15:4, those things are written for our learning. Since all things which are lawful remain so until or unless they are modified, instrumental music is still lawful, for it was never modified. Now, by the way, on that chart that Hatcher had up here where he talked about animals and clothing and so forth in the Old Testament law, let me tell you something about that, ladies and gentlemen, if I can find that here. In Acts chapter 15, verses 28 and 29, all these things are covered. Acts 15, verses 28 and 29, none of these things are reaffirmed in the New Testament. Psalms is reaffirmed, Mr. Hatcher. Show me where in the New Testament a horse and a donkey with a mule is reaffirmed. Show me where planting corns and beans and wearing clothing and all this kind of stuff is reaffirmed in the New Testament. So, he can't use that kind of, that's what we call red herrings, irrelevant material. Now look at this. Not only was it never modified, its use is reaffirmed. Reaffirmed up there. Not only was it never modified, it was reaffirmed. Hence, the approved example of the use of instruments in the Bible is singular. They are always approved of God when used to honor God. Nowhere are instrumental musical instruments condemned. So, look at these instances I have on the chart here. All these passages show you where the instrumental music is approved of God. Now, let's go to necessary inference number 1 for instrumental music. Since I'm showing you direct command, approved example, and necessary inference. Y'all know what that means, don't you? You've heard it about 5,000 times in this pulpit. You never hear it from the Bible, but you hear it from Mr. Hatcher. You can't read that language in the Bible, but you can read it in the spiritual sword. That's where you get all that jargon. That jargon. Now listen, necessary inference for instrumental music. I'm taking the assumption here now that necessary inference is a way to argue. Since the anti-instrumental music adherents say the New Testament is silent on instruments, we must infer the continued lawfulness of instruments. Law is in effect until annulled or modified. If the New Testament is silent on instruments, the law on instruments is still in effect. The law approved the use of instruments in worship. That law did, that Old Testament law, and he says it's silent on musical instruments in the New Testament. So therefore the law on musical instruments never been touched. Therefore, the alleged silence in the New Testament leads us to necessarily infer, and David Brown likes to do this kind of thinking, that the use of psalms incorporates instrumental music. We have to infer that, because there's nothing said in the New Testament to modify, annul, repeal the Old Testament law. Silence is not an argument against instrumental music. Rather, it is an evidence that there has been no change on the use of instruments with the psalms. Many other Old Testament things are delineated as being patterns, figures, shadows, example, and for the time, Hebrews 9 and 10. But instruments are never mentioned. N.B. Hardeman being the witness, Boswell-Hardeman debate, page 187. Now, M1, music has always been acceptable in the praise of God. You show me one time in the Bible where music, instrumental music, ever was rejected of God when it was used in the praise of God. I'll give you $500 for that one. Psalm 150, verse 6. Let everything have breath praise the Lord. Not only with the voice, but with instruments also, whether privately, publicly, in the home, in the congregation of saints in all ages, of which we have record. And some of the earliest record is right here. Patriarchal times, Adam's time, and Job's time. It goes all the way back before the law, before Moses. God has always accepted such praise, and has never abrogated, annulled, or rescinded the lawfulness of the use of instrumental music. And then I'll give you RD1. I'm going to throw some of Brother Hatcher's brethren at him. He likes to talk about these brethren being in disagreement, but they all agree on this subject. Well, sure they do, but I'm going to show you how they agree. They agree to disagree on so many things that it's embarrassing, I think. Now, here's one that agrees to disagree with Mr. Hatcher. Roy Deaver says, sing does not exclude play. Now, Mr. Hatcher, I want you to look at this now. Look up here. Sing does not exclude play. Does Hatcher agree with Roy Deaver or not? He doesn't agree with him. I'm just showing you how these men contradict one another when they fight the truth. When you start opposing the truth, you know, it doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter how bad you are. It's like the Pharisees and Sadducees. They can get together against Jesus, you see, and they hate one another. The Romans and the Jews can get together against Jesus. They hate one another. Well, Hatcher and Deaver can get together against instrumental music, but they can't agree among themselves. Give me the next chart. RD number 2. Now we got a little artwork here about these brethren. Roy Deaver refuting Michael Hatcher. Show their picture up there. Does that look like Michael? That's his high school graduation picture. Now, Hatcher says, when God specifies singing, that excludes any other type of music. That excludes singing with an instrument of music, and also excludes instrumental music by itself. But Deaver refutes Hatcher. Deaver said, it is simply wrong, Mr. Hatcher. You're simply wrong for one to argue that sing excludes play. And that's from the Spiritual Sword, the Encyclopedia of Bible Doctrine. Sing does not exclude play, and I've got Roy Deaver's book over here to prove it to you, Ascertaining Bible Authority. Sing does not exclude play. G.C. Brewer and Allen Hire support the position of Deaver in the Spiritual Sword, 790, page 3. So that's Deaver, Brewer, and Hires versus Mr. Hatcher, and I don't know what Mr. Brown's going to say about it. Now we have Roy Deaver saying he agrees with the Christian church. Can you believe it? Christian church across the street over here, that way or that way. Roy Deaver says, I agree with him. Look at this. This is in the Firm Foundation magazine of July 1986. And he says, I hasten to express agreement with each of the above points. Let's give it the larger one so we can read it, brother, the next one. RD number 4 it is. We can read it a little bit better, hear what Deaver has to say. I blew it up so we could read it a little better. And he's talking about the Christian church. What are their arguments? They have stressed the forms of and, singing, and making melody. They stress that making melody is the Greek word solantes, which is from solo. They've argued that solo means to touch, play, and pluck the strings off. They've argued that therefore the word solo itself implies the instrument, the thing that is being touched. I hasten to express agreement with each of the above points. Roy Deaver agreeing with the Christian church on this matter that they have argued all these years. And he says, what is to be touched? What is the instrument? He says, I believe in instrumental music in the Christian worship. I do not believe in the use of mechanical instrumental music in Christian worship. And he contends that the heart is the instrument. But the point I want you to get is this. Not what Deaver says about the heart. He can believe that if he wants to. But he grants that solo implies the instrument. And they've tried to argue for years, as Mr. Hatcher has. He's got it in the newspaper, and I'll show it to you before this debate's over. He put it in the newspaper that solo lost its meaning, changed its meaning. In the New Testament, when Paul used it, it didn't mean to play, it meant to sing. Roy Deaver's got enough sense to tell you the truth. He's telling you that solo means play. and we'll have some more of that as we go along here. Now let's go on to the next one, RD number 5. I'm going to show you what Roy Deaver has to say about it. You say, well, who is Roy Deaver? Well, if you don't know who Roy Deaver is, just go ahead and take a nap. Just go ahead and take a nap. You're not going to get anything out of this debate anyway. If you don't know who Roy Deaver is in the Church of Christ up here in Texas, just go ahead and take a nap. We won't disturb you. He says, and this is out of his book, Ascertaining Bible Authority. Look at this mark here. Just, what?
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay, he says here, did not exclude play. In fact, in the Old Testament, the Israelites were indeed instructed to sing and also to play. The sing did not exclude play. Mr. Hatcher says it does exclude play, and he says also that solo means to sing. So in Ephesians, he's got what Deaver says would be singing and singing, rather than singing and making melody or playing. We'll get into more of this in our next speech tomorrow night, and you come and bring somebody with you, and we hope that you'll profit from